And I always give it a minute to make sure the sound and stuff is all working.
And people watch live on YouTube, or they have to join this application?
YouTube. This is just for the video conference calling. So this is just for me and you. They watch on YouTube.
And it's live right now on YouTube.
Yep.
Okay.
It looks like it's live. I hope it's live. So yeah. Yeah, it looks like we're live. So Bernardo, thanks for coming on and being willing to have a conversation with me. Would you mind
Pleasure to
telling
be
us
here.
a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. My education is computer engineering and philosophy. Most of my professional career has been in science, computer engineering. I do have a PhD in philosophy as well, but that's sort of my second life. I write books, articles, essays on philosophy, especially about the mind, body problem, philosophy of mind, ontology, all that good stuff.
Awesome. So your position is that are you an idealist? Is that correct? You believe that everything
That's
is
right.
fundamentally mind?
Yeah, I'm a metaphysical idealist, meaning that I think the essence of reality is mental. Not necessarily that it's in my mind alone or your mind alone. There is something out there, but that something out there is mental. It's excitations or patterns of excitation of consciousness.
And why do you hold that position as opposed to materialism?
I think it's a much more parsimonious position, which doesn't incur into the insoluble problems of materialism, like the so-called the hard problem of consciousness. Materialists cannot find a way, not even in principle, to deduce the qualities of experience, like what it is like to taste a strawberry or to have a bellyache, to deduce these qualities from the quantitative parameters that characterize, for instance, our brains. There's nothing about the material brain in terms of which we could deduce our inner experience. And I think they incur that problem because they invent this category called matter outside and independent of mind. And then they try to reduce themselves to it, which is impossible. It's like a dog chasing its own tail. So I think the explanatory power of materialism and the logical consistency, the parsimony, is much superior, because an idealist would just say, well, there is something out there, all right, but it is mental as well. And it appears from our perspective in the form that we call matter, just like my brain appears to you in the form that you call matter. But my brain, in my view, is just the way my inner experience looks like from a second or third person perspective. And I think the same goes for the inanimate universe. The matter in the inanimate universe is just what transpersonal mental states look like when we observe them.
You mentioned the hard problem of consciousness, and you said that it's an intractable problem that materialists can't solve. But it seems like, for me, from my perspective, all the idealist is doing is well, just saying, well, we can't reduce it. We're just going to claim it's a fundamental thing in and of itself. And it seems like materialists could do that too, and just claim that consciousness is just a material thing. But it seems more like the CD sound problem, where if you put a CD in a computer, listening to the sound that comes out of your speakers, you could never reverse engineer what's on the CD until you actually know the programming language of the computer and then how it's read on a CD. And so there's no combination of things that could be on the sound that you listen to from the music that you could use to reverse engineer the CD.
Of,
But that doesn't mean it's impossible to go from the sound to the CD. And the same could be true of conscious experience. The fact that we
of course,
can't. Go ahead.
it's entirely possible to go from the sound to the CD if you define sound not at the experience you have when you listen to it, but if you define sound as the patterns of pressure oscillations in the air, which is what it is from a materialist perspective, you can surely reduce that to your CD, to the grooves that you see on your CD, if you would amplify that, to the mechanisms, the electronic mechanisms in the CD, to the speaker. It's entirely reducible. What is not reducible is when you say, the melody I hear and I experience, I cannot reduce that to the CD and the sound system, which is the problem of materialism, I agree. Yeah.
Well, the analogy I'm trying to draw is that if before you knew how a computer worked, and you heard sound from a speaker, like if we got somebody from the 1700s and we put them in front of a computer and we take a CD and say there's music on this CD and we're going to put it into a computer and they're going to listen to it, there's no way that they can listen to the sound and then know what's happening on the CD. It would be impossible for them because they don't have the framework to understand all of how that works, just like how we don't have the framework to understand how the brain works right now. But it doesn't follow that it's impossible to do that. Like if we could potentially draw a connection between how conscious experience works and the brain, then it would actually potentially be possible to uh, bridge that gap of the hard problem. The reason it's a hard problem is not because it's impossible, but because there isn't a guiding framework that can give us the kind of decoding pattern we need to go from the sound to the CD. All we have is the sound. And so there's infinitely many possible ways that it could potentially be translated into a material thing that we just don't understand. But because we lack the processes, that's what makes it impossible. It's not impossible because it is impossible in principle.
I think that is just a way to hide a misunderstanding of what's going on. I completely disagree with you because matter is defined as something that is exhaustively described in quantitative ways. I exhaustively describe material arrangement in terms of mass, charge, momentum, geometric relationships, field interactions, frequencies, amplitudes. If you define matter that way, it's fundamentally incommensurable with the qualities of experience. So to say that, well, mind is reducible to matter, we just haven't found a way to do that yet, it's to hide behind complexity. It's to appeal to an unknown when in fact you're creating an impossible situation for yourself. You are inventing an ontological category called matter and then trying to reduce yourself to it. It's like I use this metaphor a lot. It's like a painter that paints a self-portrait and then points at it and says, I am that portrait. And then he says, well, I can't reduce myself to a pattern of pigment distribution on canvas because it's just too complex. But one day in the future, I will do that. Well, good luck with that.
Oh, I'm not really sure what you mean because I'm sure there's lots about natural matter that we don't know about yet that we don't understand. And it would be more akin to say that I'm using paint to paint on myself. Like I am the portrait and I'm using paint to paint on myself. I mean, that would be, and so then I'm then made of paint. And so it would follow that if I can use the paint to paint myself and I am the one being painted, then I would follow that I was made of paint in the analogy you used. So it doesn't seem like I'm painting a separate painting. That would be not quite analogous since we
It's
are the
completely
matter
analogous. Of course it is. I mean, all you have is mental states, is experience. You never escape that. You're talking to me now from your point of view, it's an experience, and so it is for me. So we are locked within an experiential environment, an environment of mental states. And then we define something that isn't that isn't a mental state. The moment you do that, you're painting a self-portrait elsewhere. You're not putting paint on yourself. You're not putting paint on your inner life. You're saying there is something else beyond and fundamentally inaccessible to my conscious inner life because it isn't consciousness. And by the way, somehow I am that. I have to reduce myself to that. And it's by definition incommensurable with the first thing you start from, which is your experiences. That's all you have. That's where you start from. And then you try to reduce yourself to something that is by definition not that. It creates an impassable obstacle, an impassable chasm in between these two things that we can't solve. And then we created this promissory note saying, well, it's just very complex. You know what? So one day, maybe, well, complexity works for as long as you are in the same ontological ground. Then you can appeal to complexity, like your CD metaphor. You can't explain how a CD produces sounds to somebody from the 15th century. I agree with you. It's too much complexity for that person to wrap his head around it, but it's complexity within the same ontological ground. It's matter in one case, matter in the other case. But when we talk about reducing consciousness, you have to go across an ontological abyss. So you can't just appeal to complexity, because when people say, well, consciousness emerges out of the complexity of the brain, and presumably we could build a computer that is even more complex than a brain, or as complex as a brain, and somehow consciousness would emerge out of that as well. That's hiding behind complexity, because you see, I'm a computer engineer. I've built computers for many years. Everything that you do in a computer with electric switches, you could do, in principle, with pipes, pressure valves, and water. It would be the size of a country, perhaps, But everything a computer does, you can do with pipes, water, and pressure valves. It's an enormous network of pipes and valves going around and water flowing and creating pressure, current. But can you imagine a network of pipes, valves, and water that is so big, so complex that somehow it will produce images instead of opening and closing valves and water streaming around? You can't. These are incommensurable things.
But wait a
Water
minute.
flowing.
Computers do produce images, and
Yeah.
they are just valves opening and closing. So they
So
do exactly that.
no, they don't do that at all. Uh, I'm thinking about the CPU, the processing unit of a computer. A display is something else. A display will receive, say, water coming through the pipes, and then there is a certain mechanism of excitation that causes photons to be, well, photons are emitted from the backplane of your display, and you cause these little pixels to open or close to let the light through. Okay, that's something else. It's something made for producing images. But my brain is not producing images, projecting images outside. I'm not a display. I'm not a projector. My brain is computing. It's performing data processing. And somehow that data processing is accompanied by experience. So the analogy would be a CPU, a central processing unit in a computer, performing all this data crunching, these data calculations it does, and being so complex that somehow the data processing of the CPU is also accompanied by experience. In other words, your computer processor has an inner life. There is something it is like to be your computer processor. That's absurd. No matter how complex you make your computer processor, at the end of the day, it's still just opening and closing electric switches. And you can have a whole lot of electric switches, countless electric switches, but it's still just opening and closing those switches. It's just like the valves are just opening and closing and letting water through or not. You may have a gazillion valves and a gazillion pipes, but it's still doing just that. So it's an appeal to magic to say that something so incommensurable, by definition, incommensurable with respect to matter, can arise out of sheer complexity. It's hand waving.
Well, I'm not saying sheer complexity. I'm saying that there is some mechanical process that can produce it. Just saying complexity wouldn't mean anything. So I'm saying that when you mentioned that we're not projectors, well, I would just disagree. I'd say the consciousness is essentially just a screen that is a projector, essentially, and where it's just created by some mechanical process we don't understand. Just like in the 15th century, the sound is produced by by a mechanical process that the person doesn't understand, and they would make the same argument. They'd say, "Oh well, there's clearly this CD is not made of sound. Sound is something ontologically separate than this CD. There's obviously no sound in it. You shake it, there's no sound. You can bend it, there's no sound. You can't break it open and find sound. There must ontologically be different categories." And that argument seems to be exactly the same as your argument, where our conscious
It's
experience is
completely
just,
different. I mean, you can keep on repeating this, and we will agree to disagree at the end. Uh, you can produce material phenomenon out of other material phenomena that seem to be of very different classes. Sound, visual images, photons, whatever. But you have to remember that you have to abstract away your experience of those phenomena. You cannot talk about sound in terms of what you hear, images in terms of what you experience when you see it. You have to talk about images in terms of photons, of different energies or frequencies. You have to talk about sound in terms of frequencies of air pressure oscillations. And you have to remove your experience of those, because otherwise you're just begging the question. You're appealing to the very hard problem that you're denying if you do that. So can air pressure oscillations be rationally reduced to the movements of a speaker? Of course it can. Can the movement of a speaker be rationally reduced to the flow of currents and voltages that drive the speaker? Of course it can. Can that be reduced to an electronic circuit that produces those currents and voltage variations? Of course it can. And can the electronic circuit then be understood to pick up its input from a magnetic disk or an optical disk? Of course it can. If you remove your experience from all that, there is a very clear chain of causation. And you can explain these wildly different physical phenomena, such as air pressure oscillations on the one hand, and patterns on an optical disc on the other hand. You can reduce one to the other. There's enormous complexity in between, but there is a rational chain of reduction. The problem is when you put experience and you say experience arises from something that I define as not being experiential, then you run into trouble. And you know, nobody can articulate, at least in principle, how a jump from material arrangements to qualitative experience could at all be made. I can argue in principle that a computer I don't understand does stuff that I don't understand. I don't know how it's doing that, but I can argue in principle, in terms of first principles, for how that could conceivably be happening. But we can't do that when it comes to the hard problem of consciousness. And I think the reason we can't do that is because we made the problem impossible to begin with by defining matter as something that is completely abstract, has none of the qualities of experience, is defined exhaustively in terms of quantities, such as mass, charge, momentum, geometrical relationships, and all that. When we do that, we make it by definition impossible to return from that realm of abstraction back to the only thing we have, which is the realm of qualitative experience. And if you don't accept this, then you have to say, give a promissory note. You have to say, well, it's just somehow it's a matter of complexity, and one day we will get there. But then I would repeat the answer I gave to you earlier, which is, doesn't matter how complicated you make a circuit of pipes, water, and pressure valves, you cannot make that thing create experience. There is no reason for you to think that. Let me give you another example that maybe is easier to understand. Imagine you have a hi-fi system and produces sound, right? It's all it does. It has speakers. It induces air pressure oscillations in the environment, and you pick it up as sound. And you say, okay, now let's make this hi-fi system more complex. I'm going to add boosters, filters. I'm going to add more speakers. And then after you do that, you say, I'm going to make it even more complex. And you add some feedback mechanisms and more speakers, more boosters. And at some point, you make it as large as a country, full of speakers and filters and all that. It will still not produce images. You cannot get a hi-fi system to produce images by adding speakers to it. For the same reason that you can't make a computer generate experience by adding transistors to it. These are incommensurable things. Making sound more complex doesn't make it visual. Making a computer more complex doesn't make it suddenly have experience if it didn't have in the beginning. Because all you're adding to it are things of the same kind. You're adding more transistors, you're adding more interconnect wires or traces on a PCB. As you add more speakers to a hi-fi, you're adding more of the same kind. And no complexity of more of the same kind can generate something that is of a completely, fundamentally other kind at an ontological level. And I think that's the problem we are facing.
Well, I think you're begging the question. Like, to me, it just sounds like a composition division fallacy, because I can keep saying, well, you can keep adding bricks, but you'll never get a wall. No matter how many bricks you add, there'll never be a wall, because there's just bricks. They're all the same kind of bricks, and walls are just of an ontologically different kind. Well, I mean, if you assume it's an ontologically different kind.
Do you sincerely believe that what you're saying now defeats my argument?
Yes, because I believe your argument is the exact same thing. I mean, it's the same argument that people used against Einstein when they said...
And there is very, very little basis for a conversation. I mean, you're appealing to terminology. We give a wall to a set of bricks for convenience, but of course a wall is just a set of bricks.
Right, and I think consciousness is just a material process. I mean, I think your argument is essentially just defining consciousness to be a new ontological category, but there's no basis for that.
You are defining consciousness as a material process, which is arbitrary, because by definition, a material process is that which is not conscious, is that which does not have experiential states. So basically what you're saying, and you are not alone in this, there's a lot of people saying the same thing, some crazy people, they're saying that consciousness doesn't actually exist, that there are no such things as phenomenal states. And Daniel Dennett says that, Keith Frankish says that, Patricia Churchland says that for at least certain mental states, not all of them. So, I can only throw my arms up and say that if you don't get what the hard problem of consciousness is, then yeah, it's very difficult to even begin a conversation, because essentially you are denying that consciousness exists.
Well, I don't deny consciousness exists. I just think consciousness is an emergent property of matter. So I don't define matter as being ontologically separate from consciousness. I believe that there is a combination of matter that can get consciousness, just like there's a combination of bricks that gets a wall and a combination of ones and zeros that can get sound. You just have to find the right medium. So, I mean, your argument seems to me to be a lot like the argument that philosophers used against Einstein in his theory of general relativity. They said, no, time can't bend. Time isn't a physical object. It's just a category error between two different ontological states. Time isn't it's a philosophical concept. It can't physically bend. And then Einstein came along and said, no, it literally does. Here's an experiment to prove it. And then he did, and then they were all just defeated. So I think that your argument seems to be kind of like an argument from ignorance, where we define consciousness in this way, we define matter in this way, therefore the definition is incompatible. But reality doesn't care about our definitions at all.
Certainly not. I certainly don't care how people define consciousness arbitrarily, because I know what consciousness is. It's my experiential states, which I assume at least most other people share with me. Maybe some don't. Maybe some are philosophical zombies. I don't know. So it's not a matter of definition. I mean, we may have difficulty in getting the words right, but we know what it is, at least the ones amongst us that are conscious. And matter, it's not up for debate. Matter, there is a definition for it, and does not entail conscious states. It does not entail experiential properties, unless you're a panpsychist. But then we wouldn't be having the discussion if you were a panpsychist. So matter, by definition, is not what consciousness is, as far as what we experience from a first-person perspective. And then you can say, well, I define consciousness as an emergent property of matter. Okay, be my guest, but it's just a game of words, because by defining consciousness that way, you are not explaining what consciousness actually is from a first-person perspective. If you know what I mean. You're solving a pseudo problem. You're not solving it, you're just defining it as something that is solvable. Yeah, I don't know what else I can add to what I just said.
Well, again, it seems like what you're doing is taking the definition. Like you mentioned that matter is defined as that which is not conscious. Now, as from my perspective, science doesn't define what matter is. Matter is defined by matter. So reality defines. Well, no, science just creates a useful definition of how we understand it. Science doesn't say this is matter and the matter can't be anything other than this. So reality defines what matter is. Science doesn't. So it's the fact that science slapped a label on matter doesn't make matter that. So it doesn't limit matter or what matter can do in any sense. So it seems like
matter is exhaustively described by quantities such as mass, charge, momentum, or fields are exhaustively defined by quantities such as frequencies, amplitudes of vibration. None of this entails an experiential state. I mean, if you look at our theories of everything, the equations that are supposed to be complete in terms of describing every natural phenomenon, they only have quantities in them. And the bridge between a quantity defined as a variable in physics and an experiential state is completely arbitrary. Spin up could be warmth, spin down could be cold, or the other way around. It's completely arbitrary. There is nothing about the properties that exhaustively define matter in physics. And I disagree with you that there is no definition of matter. Of course there is. It's the basics of physics. And what materialists will say is matter is that which is described by physical equations. Otherwise, if you say, well, I will change the definition of matter, and I will say that matter also entails experiential states. Okay, but that would make you a panpsychist, not a materialist. Or you could say matter is what physics describes exhaustively, meaning nothing is missing from that description. And that's all there is. There are no experiential states. Okay, that would also be an internally consistent definition, but of course it would leave out the one undeniable thing about existence, which is that there are experiential states.
Well, that's my main disagreement with you, is where you say exhaustively. Well, all the scientific and physics descriptions are just that. They're descriptions. They give us nothing about ontology fundamentally. There could always be more stuff there that we don't understand. And the fact that all of our descriptions entail purely just numbers and masses and the other things you mentioned, that doesn't mean that is what exhausts the ontology of matter. There could be more there that we don't understand, and that may not include consciousness, but it may include ways to get consciousness through emergent properties.
Science makes no ontological commitment if done correctly. Science is not materialistic. Science is not idealistic. Science is a description of the behavior of nature, or a method to describe and predict the behavior of nature. It says nothing about what nature is in and of itself. It will not tell you that an electron is or is not conscious in and of itself. That's not science. That's philosophy. Materialism is a philosophy. It is a metaphysics, an ontology, which is a more specific part of metaphysics. Materialism will say there is nothing to what is described beyond what I find in the description. In other words, materialism will go to science and say whatever is part of the scientific equations is what is, and there is nothing more about that. Is this science? No, it is philosophy. But it's a philosophy that leverages a scientific description and says that matter is that which is exhaustively described by the quantities and physical models. That is materialism. If you add anything to that, if you add experiential or phenomenal properties to an electron or a proton, that's already panpsychism. Now, if you say, my physical models may not be complete, there may be things about nature that I haven't found out yet. God knows, in dark energy, dark matter, whatever, supersymmetrical particles that we haven't found yet, whatever. You can still be a materialist even if you admit that those equations may not be complete, so long as you say that these things that are missing can also be quantitatively described and added to our set of descriptions that exhaustively defines nature or describes nature. So even unknown properties, unknown today, can still be part of a consistent, coherent version of materialism if you say that those properties are exhaustively defined by quantities and added to those equations. But no equation you can possibly conceive will give you a means to deduce from it what it feels like to be anything in nature. Because this, what it feels like to be, is a quality. It's not a quantity. There is more to experience than the quantities that define it. If you are born blind, I can give you the frequencies of oscillation of every color in the visible spectrum, and it will not allow you to understand what it feels like to see a color. If you are born deaf, I can give you the precise power spectrum of a Vivaldi sonata plus all the phase information, and you still not know what it feels like to listen to a Vivaldi sonata. For exactly the same reason, even if one day we arrive at a theory of everything that works, that unifies the micro universe with the macro universe, quantum physics with relativity, gravity, and all that, it will still be an equation that is manipulating quantities. And for somebody who does not have the senses to experience the universe through hearing, through seeing, that equation will be missing something very important, which is what it is like to experience it. And my point is, materialism is the philosophy that says that whatever science can model is what is, even if we are missing some things, but we can model it in the future, make our equations bigger, create more physical properties. That's all there is. And my point is that fundamentally misses what it is like to experience, even if you can abstractly describe and correctly predict the behavior of every last elementary particle in the universe.
Right, but so if we imagine like there's a material process that we can use that can make a non-material thing or non-conscious thing conscious, we can add the property to it. And we actually know there are some processes that do this. It's called childhood, birth, reproduction. We can see that there's a material process going on there with something that is not conscious, or as far as we can tell, becomes conscious, as far as we can tell. And so it seems like
you're begging the question.
Well, I think you're begging the question, but that's let's suppose that we take that process and we can replicate it through purely just mechanistic, like steal, not instead of being biological, we can just do it with computers or whatever, and we can create a non-brain or a non-conscious just piece of silicone, which we assume, or we will assume it's non-conscious for the purpose of the argument. We can make it follow the same argument to get to the similar looking results. If we look at it, it seems exactly like a child does. It seems reasonable to think that we've gone from a non-conscious state and we've given it consciousness. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely not.
How so?
You're thinking in a subtly dualistic term, in very nuanced dualistic terms. You're saying, well, a material arrangement that was unconscious until a certain moment, T, and then on T plus 1, something changes in that material arrangement and poof, it becomes conscious. There is a subtle dualism in this, which is I go from matter to something that's not matter. I add a fundamentally different property. For an idealist, all matter is the extrinsic appearance, the image of an inner conscious process. And that's all there is to it. So for an idealist, there is no such a thing as the moment in which consciousness is created, because consciousness is that within which everything that is created is created. It's the matrix of all existence. So for me, as an idealist, birth is the moment when we create a dissociated complex within consciousness. And that's this.
What do you mean by that? Like, so when we see a person being physically born, is that not a new consciousness? That's
No, for an idealist, no. For at least for my formulation of idealism, there is only consciousness, and it's transpersonal. It's not something bound in space. A living being is the appearance, the image of a dissociated process in this universal consciousness, if you will. So when certain mental processes within the universal consciousness split off, become dissociated from the rest, dissociation is something we understand in psychiatry. There's plenty of empirical evidence for it happening. We understand more or less the mechanisms. You can even image that. A person can become dissociated inside, and you can put that person in a brain scanner, and you can see what those dissociated processes look like. My argument would be, a living being is the image of a dissociated process. And matter is what the dissociated process looks like from across its dissociative boundary. So from across your dissociative boundary, you appear to me as this physical body that I'm looking at on my screen right now. The same for me. My inner dissociated inner life, and it is dissociated because I don't know what you're thinking. I don't know what's happening on the galaxy of Andromeda. Somehow I'm dissociated from the rest. And therefore, I am a dissociative process within a broader context of consciousness. And my dissociative process appears to you, or looks like from your perspective, as a living being, in a way very much analogous to how dissociative process in the mind of a person with dissociative identity disorder has an appearance under a brain scanner. Understand what I mean?
Sort of, but not exactly. So you're saying that essentially, when a person is born and becomes conscious as we experience it, they're not actually becoming consciousness. There was some already pre-existing consciousness there that simply became dissociated.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. So my inner life, my thoughts will appear to you as my mental activity. If you would put me now in a fMRI scanner, a functional brain scanner, you would see certain patterns of brain activity. If you cut my skull open like neurosurgeons do and look at my brain, everything you would see in that brain scanner or by looking at my brain directly would be the extrinsic appearance of my conscious inner life. It's what my thoughts, my emotions look like to you. In other words, for me, the brain doesn't create personal consciousness. For me, the brain is what personal consciousness looks like from across its dissociative boundary.
But you said that's what all matter is, the dissociative.
All matter.
So including rocks would also be a dissociation.
No. I think life is the image of dissociation. But you see, as far as I can experience, there is nothing it's like to be a single neuron in my brain. My brain as a whole is the image of the unitary process that I experience as my personal inner life, my brain as a whole. By separating my brain into parts, that separation is just nominal. It's arbitrary. It's for convenience. There is only one image, the image of my conscious inner life, and that's my working brain. There's nothing it's like to be a single neuron. There is only what it's like to be my entire nervous system, my entire body as a whole. And that's me, what I experience from within. So for me, a rock is like that isolated neuron. There is nothing it's like to be a rock in and of itself. In the same way that there's nothing it's like to be a single neuron in my head in and of itself. There is only something it is like to be me as a whole. So I would say, by the same line of argument, that there is only something it's like to be the inanimate universe as a whole. A rock is just a nominally separated part of the unitary image that we call the inanimate universe as a whole. That is the image of inner life. So I would say there are universal, instinctive, experiential states which appear to us as the inanimate universe. There is something it's like to be the inanimate universe. If I could be as a whole, not as a rock, just as there's nothing it's like to be a single neuron in your head, if you know what I mean. A rock is just part of that image. We separate that image in chunks for convenience, but it's completely nominal. It's just a matter of names, definitions. Like we define the boundaries of a car in a way that allows us to speak about a car or to go and buy a car. But functionally, a car is just part of the inanimate universe. It wouldn't work if gravity weren't pulling it to the road. It wouldn't work if there weren't air coming in to facilitate combustion, cool the engine. So there is no such a thing as a car. It wouldn't work if you would isolate it from the rest of the universe. It's a nominal definition. A moon is a nominal definition.
Okay, but when we see these things, the non-conscious single neurons that you don't believe there is anything like to be a single neuron, when they grow in a test tube or in a person and become a more full brain, then they somehow become, there is something that it is like to be them because they gain the consciousness.
I'm not saying that there is no consciousness underlying a neuron. If my nervous system is the image of my conscious inner life, then every single neuron only exists by virtue of my conscious inner life. It's the image of it. If I didn't have a conscious inner life, there wouldn't be any neurons. Do you see what I mean? So the consciousness underlies the neuron, but there is nothing it's like to be the neuron in and of itself. There is only something it's like to be my entire nervous system, the neuron being a part of that. So I think consciousness underlies all matter, because matter, I think, is what conscious inner life looks like from across a dissociative boundary. That's how I would define what we call matter. But consciousness underlies a rock. If there were no inner life in the inanimate universe, there would be no rock, because a rock is part of the image of that inner life, of that conscious inner life. But there isn't anything it's like to be the rock in and of itself. It's just part of an image that's grounded in conscious states. So consciousness underlies all matter. The question is, what corresponds to dissociated alters of consciousness and what doesn't? But it's all grounded in consciousness.
But right, so if we have one rock and there's nothing that's like to be that one rock, but if we combine lots of rocks together into essentially a brain, a physical brain because it's just made of rocks, there is something that's like to be that brain.
I think the image of a dissociative process in universal consciousness is biology. So I don't think if you put enough rocks together, you could create a dissociation in the universal inner life of the inanimate universe.
So if we actually did create artificial intelligence with silicon, would that disprove your theory?
No, because intelligence has nothing to do with consciousness. Intelligence is a particular way of manipulating data and reacting within an environment. I've worked with artificial intelligence for a long time. I completely believe we will be able to come to, if we don't kill ourselves before that, we will get to a point where we will have machines that are indistinguishable from people and probably more intelligent than people. But I don't think...
You'd say they wouldn't have consciousness.
I think consciousness would underlie them in the sense that consciousness underlies everything, but I don't think they would be the image of a dissociative process
So they would be
in
more like the
consciousness.
rocks and not like the people.
Yes, yes, there would be nothing it's like to be that robot in and of itself. That robot is part of a bigger image that we call the inanimate universe. And it's just a process running in universal conscious inner life. In the same way that a little piece of your brain is doing something there that you can point it and say, well, I see that little process there, but it's not dissociated from the rest. It's part of a broader image. So I think artificial intelligence will come. Come on, will come. It's already happening. Um, but artificial consciousness, which I would define as inducing dissociation in universal consciousness, that I don't think we have any reason to believe that the image of a dissociative process uh, could be silicon, because the instances we know have to do with metabolism, have to do with DNA, protein folding, all the good stuff that underlies life. And you can simulate life in a silicon computer, but a simulation is not the phenomenon that it simulates. For instance, I like to give this example as well. I could, in principle, not in principle, I can simulate down to the molecular detail kidney function on my computer. I have an Apple iMac in front of me. It's fast enough to do that. I could simulate kidney function down to the molecular detail. But that will not make my computer pee on my desk. My computer will not start urinating because I'm running an exact simulation of kidney function down to the molecular level. Why? Because a simulation is not the phenomenon it simulates. It's analogous to it according to certain patterns that we consider salient and relevant. So you replicate those patterns in another medium, but that's just a simulation. I don't think by simulating the patterns of information flow or information processing in our brain, we will create another dissociative complex in universal consciousness. In other words, we'll create another form of life. I think we are just simulating it. And a simulation can certainly be intelligent.
Well, so if we could potentially simulate all of the different processes to produce life, essentially like childhood or whatever, and create a similar or more advanced brain and that can do everything humans can do or better, why would you assume that's not conscious? Why wouldn't it be essentially like when you see a child being born, why do you assume that's conscious if we cannot just do the same thing with the silicone and assume that isn't conscious?
Well, the answer is so terribly obvious that a lot of people miss it. Because a silicon computer is not at all like life. It's a completely different thing. It's not carbon-based, it's silicon-based, it operates according to digital switches. There is no protein folding, there is no DNA, there's none of this stuff of life. So even by asking this question, we are already betraying the fact that we mistake the simulation for the thing simulated when it comes to consciousness, a mistake that we don't make when it comes to just about everything else. I mean, you would never think that if you simulate kidney function on your computer, your computer would urinate. You would never think that. But or that if you simulate insulin production in your computer, that you can install your computer in somebody's body and the person will get insulin. But when it comes to consciousness, because from the materialist perspective, it seems so mysterious that it's not patently obvious to us that a simulation is not the thing it's simulating. And then it leads you to even ask that question to me, while the question you have to ask is, what would make you believe that that thing would be in any way whatsoever comparable to a biological child being born?
Well,
What would make you believe that? That is the question.
Well, you like use your liver example. Instead of simulating a liver, we can make a liver without using folding proteins. We can literally just physically build one out of pipes and pressure valves and mechanical processes. So it can potentially produce urine doing that using non-biological systems. So it seems like just like a non-protein based liver can produce urine, a non-carbon based life form or brain could produce consciousness, because that seems to be like a process in the same way.
But that's the thing. In one case, you are not running into the hard problem. And in the other case, you are. For as long as you're operating within the same ontological framework, the same metaphysical ground, so to say, then yes, we probably will be able to produce a liver. It's not the case today, but we will probably be able to produce an artificial liver and an artificial pancreas and an artificial kidney, which, by the way, does exist. It's called a dialysis machine. Um, but it's within the same ontological ground. But the moment you say, okay, now I come from the sphere of structure and function, and I go to the sphere of qualitative feeling, that is the abyss. That is the jump. There is nothing about material arrangements that would allow us to deduce, even in principle, what it is like to have an experience, what it is like to pee, what it is like to have indigestion. Do you see what I mean?
Well, yeah, but we don't technically need to solve the hard problem to potentially produce consciousness. Because, for example, it's impossible for me to imagine what your experience is like, or for you to imagine what my experience is like. We're trapped in our own little conscious shells. But the same would technically be true of a computer. It could be conscious, and we would also have the same problem, or a child that we see being born. So it's potentially possible to create a conscious computer that has consciousness without us being able to solve this hard problem. We don't need to be able to solve the hard problem to necessarily create a conscious thing.
I think the reason, if you even ask yourself, what leads you to believe that I am conscious? What makes you believe that a child that has just been born is conscious? I'm asking the question to you now. What
I'm
makes you
making
believe that?
an analogy to my own experience, so it's similar
E-
enough to me, and I have the thing, and so they probably have to.
exactly. So I am analogous to you in the sense that I'm also a biological organism. I have the same organs that you have. I'm growing the same way that you are growing. Our metabolisms are equivalent. We both need to eat. We both need to drink. So there is a structural and functional analogy that it matches very close one another. And since you know that you have conscious inner life, when you see somebody else in front of you that looks like you in terms of all structure and function that you can measure or register, you'd think, oh, that thing there also has conscious inner life because it's analogous to me. But man, a silicon computer isn't analogous to you. Doesn't matter how much makeup you put on it, it is not analogous to you. Even if on the outside it may look somewhat analogous, now just under the surface, it's a completely different beast. For one thing, it's not metabolizing at all. It's operating on the basis of electronic switches and electricity. So what would make you think that that thing is conscious? The reason you have to think that I am conscious is not on the table. It's not analogous to you.
Well, I mean, for example, if you imagine an alien coming from outer space and it came and essentially had the same intellectual capabilities we do, we can do math, we can build things. I mean, it seems reasonable to assume it's conscious even before we know whether or not it's silicone or whether or not it's carbon based, just based off of the things it can do. So I don't think the similarity comes from the fact that it's a biological organism. I think that we could draw the same similarity even from someone from the 1500s before we knew about biology or cells or proteins folding. We could say that person can do X, Y, and Z like speech and math and whatever. Therefore, it's probably conscious. So it seems like that similarity argument doesn't really apply to biology as much as it just does the things that we can do with whatever we're made of.
I don't think so. I think okay. There are two parts to what you said. The alien that comes from another planet and somebody from the 1500s. A person from the 1500s, and there was a lot more violence in the world back then. You know, you would see other people being cut and bleeding just the same way that you get cut and bleed. You would see other people losing a limb and dying in the same way that you think you may die too because you have pain or you've been hurt in the past and you almost died. So it's more than just superficial analogy. Even if those people didn't have the knowledge of metabolism that we have today, the correspondence was available in many ways, not only the functions they performed, but what the body felt like, what the body looked like, the fact that you can cut into a sofa and spill its guts, and all you have at the end is the same sofa cut in half. But if you cut a person in half, something else tends to change. It's not only two halves of a person, something else will change. So I don't buy that argument that in the 1500 the analogy would be different. I think it's the same analogy despite despite less knowledge of biology and metabolism. Now, regarding the alien, You know, Battlestar Galactica,
Yeah, the TV
the
show.
Cylons, you know, the older one from '79, with the Cylons with the little lead.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
if you would see a Cylon landing on Earth, would you immediately think this is a conscious being, or would you think, oh, it's just a sophisticated machine?
Um, like just seeing one not do anything, I'd probably just think sophisticated machine. To actually test to see if it was conscious, I'd probably have to test its functionality. What can it do?
So you know that company in the U.S., Boston Dynamics,
Hmm.
makes this cat-like robots.
Yeah, the yellow one with the four legs.
Yeah, yeah. So if you see that thing, you know, it's behaving just like an animal. Do you think it's conscious?
Probably not. No.
If you cut it in half, you just have two halves of a robot. And if you cut a cat in half, something else happens. So
Right.
that's my point. The analogy is deeper than I think we assume. And I think we are operating on the basis of these analogies, even at an unconscious level. So if you take a robot and you put a simulation of skin with rubber, like in that movie, not AI, there is a recent movie with a Swedish actress, and the back of the skull, you see it's a robot, but on the front, there's a simulation of skin.
Oh yeah. It's
So
I think I know what you're talking about.
yeah. So we have to replicate appearance to create that uncanny valley, that feeling that, oh, this thing may be conscious. So that already betrays the fact that we are looking for analogies to ourselves, that we are looking for similarities. But if the similarity is literally skin deep, then a little bit of more reasoning will lead you to conclude that, hey, I don't actually have a reason to think that this entity has a conscious inner life of its own. There is consciousness underlying that, in my view, but that's the consciousness of the inanimate universe as a whole. But consciousness of its own, dissociated conscious processes, I think we make that attribution only on the basis of similarities or analogies to ourselves.
Yeah, physical ones for sure. But can't it go the other way? So just like we would assess whether or not they're skin deep and say, oh, it looks human, but then, oh, we realize it's a machine, not conscious. We could go the other way too and say, like the Battlestar Galactica example you used, it looks unconscious, but then when we actually talk to it, like the ones from what's it?
The human
Doctor
like.
Who. Doctor Who. I love
Oh,
Doctor Who.
yeah.
The ones that don't just destroy everything. I mean, they seem conscious. Like they seem like they could be conscious because we would interact with them and say, like, oh, they have a further level of beyond just the skin deep assessment. So it seems like just as we could assess it to go in the opposite direction where it's just it seems human and we would give it conscious initially, but it's not. We could also do further assessment and say it doesn't seem conscious, but then, oh, wait, we discovered it actually has these processes. Like maybe it is. So it seems like it could go both ways in that sense.
If I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that an assessment of function is enough to make an attribution of consciousness. I don't think that's the case, because you see, if we can create a complex enough artificial intelligence on a silicon computer that function-wise you wouldn't be able to distinguish, I can conceive of that. Not only conceive, I believe it will happen. Okay. But if you keep in mind that those are still microelectronic switches opening and closing that produce the function that sort of stimulates you to attribute consciousness, would you make that same attribution if I can reproduce the exact same function, but with water pipes and pressure valves?
I would, yes. So I think that would
Really?
actually, yes, because I think it is the process itself that consciousness is. So I would say that yes, if you create like a giant like planet-sized pipes and water pressure
And
valves,
water and yeah,
I think that could
you would
actually
think
be
it's
this
conscious.
process. Yes.
Even if you could walk within it and touch every pipe and see the valves working and hear the water flowing or getting wet yourself and walk around it, you would still think that the global thing is conscious.
Yeah, I think that is definitely possible.
So what is different about this planet-sized contraption of pipes, water, and valves? What is it about it that is fundamentally different from a single water pipe and a single pressure valve in front of you? Do you think one water pipe and one pressure valve in front of you is conscious?
No,
Do you think two are?
no. Well,
10,000.
I don't think the number is what's important. I think it's the process within them. So, like, if I look at a dead body, I think that's not conscious. But if you pass electricity through it, then I think that it could be conscious because of not the number or complexity of the system, but the process within the system. So I think it's the process that's going on within the system that produces the consciousness, not the size or complexity of it.
Okay, at this abstract level, I think it's reasonable what you're saying, but let's get more concrete. So somehow adding water flowing in more pipes, in more different directions, and more valves would allow you to add this spectacular extra property to the system, which is accompanying experience. So a few water pipes and valves moving water around inside my house is not conscious, but a planet-sized water pipes of the same kind, moving the same water in the same kind of way with the same valves, somehow that would have the additional extraordinary property of having inner life. You think that's plausible to you?
Yes, I think that is possible. I think that it is the process that goes on, even like just the water pipes in my house. If we could organize them in a complicated enough way, those could be conscious. I think that if the consciousness is a result of the different pressures in the different valves producing and interacting with each other to create different kinds of complicated computational systems, and that's all consciousness is, as far as I can tell. It's just like we have a visual cortex, which I'm not sure how you perceive the different parts of the brain and how they function and what we visualize, but we know we have a visual cortex, and that's what does the vision stuff in our brain. We have a auditory areas like the Broca's area and Wicked's area, and the dorsal and ventral streams of the brain, and different parts of the brain do different things. And the reason that different parts of the brain do different things is because they're different combinations of those pipes and the pressure valves. And so I think that the consciousness as a whole is, again, just another one of those pipes and pressure valves things.
But, okay, back to the analogy I made earlier. Would adding more speakers to a hi-fi system ever allow the hi-fi system to produce an image like a television?
Actually, yes, because you can take high enough vibrations of sound, and if you vibrate like a piece of metal that has sand on it, it'll produce an image. So if you essentially have enough of those things, like if you have enough of those sound, the speakers or whatever, that produces essentially a metal plate with sand on it, you can produce an image. And so, yes, it is technically possible that sound can produce an image.
I think you're abusing my my metaphor. The point I'm trying to make is that image and sound are two incommensurable things. That's why you have eyes and ears and not the same organ system to pick up on both. And adding complexity in one of these spaces, the space of sound, will never allow you to create something in the space of images. It just creates more complex sound. And you can go in that direction ad infinitum, and you will have infinitely complex sound, but you not have an image. Maybe my sense of plausibility is different than yours, but to me, I cannot imagine adding enough pipes and pressure valves to have a system consisting of pipes and pressure valves and water magically have inner life.
Well, let's go with your sound example again. Like, if you produce enough sound with enough energy behind it, it will in fact separate the electrons from the atom, and then it will create light. So you can actually create images if you produce enough sound. It'll just take a whole bunch of sound.
The analogy has a limit. I'm trying to illustrate incommensurability with the analogy between sound and light.
Oh, absolutely. I totally understand what you're going for here, but my argument is that just in the same sense that you can stretch the analogy and go to, if you add enough sound, you could produce light indirectly. I think the same thing could apply to consciousness too.
No, because the very way you have reasoned about this means that there is a way, in principle, to deduce the emergent properties from the properties of the constituent systems, the constituent components. In other words, there is a way to deduce the images from the sound, so to say. Because that's exactly what you're saying. You're saying, I can, in principle, conceive of a reasonable way to deduce the emergent property from the constituent systems, from the speakers or the pipes and valves. But the heart of the very problem is that the statement that you can do that for everything that we call um, uh, weakly emergent properties, like sand dunes. Sand dunes are an emergent property of sand grains and wind.
Yep.
But you can deduce sand dunes from the properties of sand grains and wind. Actually, you can run a simulation on your computer, and you have the sand dunes forming and moving. You can deduce the shape of a snowflake from the properties of water molecules. You can simulate that on your computer, and you see that at certain temperatures, the molecules would tend to arrange them. Certain temperatures and pressures, the molecules will arrange themselves in that way, producing the emergent property that we call the shape of a snowflake. In all these cases, you can deduce the emergent property from the system components. But the claim of the hard problem and the challenge of the hard problem is that consciousness is not weakly emergent. It's strongly emergent, which is a code for we have no idea how it happens, because nobody has put forward a rationale for deducing the qualities of experience, at least in principle, from the characteristics of the components of the system, in this case, the molecules that make up your brain. And that is the challenge. And I think the burden here is on those that want to answer that challenge. The burden is not on me to prove that it cannot be deduced. The burden is somebody else to explain how it could be deduced, at least in principle, instead of appealing to an unknown, appealing to, well, it's just so complex that it's beyond our capability to understand. But one day we'll get there. That's not an answer. That's hiding behind complexity. That's an appeal to an unknown. I would even say it's an appeal to magic. It's an appeal to something supernatural. To me, Tom, in all honesty, to say that if I add enough pipes, enough water, and enough valves to the system, suddenly it will become conscious. To me, this is as much an appeal to magic as any miracle that has ever been claimed by any prophet on this planet. It's probably worse. It's probably more magical than that.
Well, because from my perspective, your claim seems to be the stronger one, where you're claiming from the idealist position that everything is fundamentally conscious, whereas most materialists seem to take the methodological approach of that, well, all we have reason to believe is for the material for this time, but we don't actually claim there is nothing there. It's more just it's a much weaker position than your position. So it seems like your position would have the burden of proof, because that claim that maybe it is material, we just don't know yet, seems to be a much weaker position than claiming, no, it's definitely not material. So, like, for example, if we use your analogy of saying we can, in principle, discern discern a snowflake from the processes of what produce it. Well, if we took essentially hydrogen atoms and we knew about hydrogen atoms, but we didn't know about gravity, there's no way, in principle, we could take those hydrogen atoms and add a bunch of them together to come to the conclusion there's going to get a sun. Because until we understand a gravity that will actually pull them together and have all these other additional properties to it, we'd never be able to understand how any combination of hydrogen atoms could produce a sun, which would then produce other atoms from the gravitational force that would put them together, because there's this one gigantic missing piece that we just don't have the knowledge of. And so it seems reasonable to infer that maybe there's this gigantic piece we're missing that is there, we just don't know about it yet. And that seems to be a much weaker position that doesn't hold as strong a claim as your position, which says it's definitely not the case that this.
No, well, I think you are taking for granted the starting assumptions of materialism, which are exactly the weak points of materialism. For you, it seems a much weaker claim, because I think you're overlooking the extraordinary assumptions that already happened before your line of reasoning begun, which is that there is anything that isn't experience to begin with. This root foundational claim is already an enormous step of abstraction, because you see, all we ever have is experience. What is fundamentally beyond our experience, either directly or indirectly, for instance, I believe that you have experiences, and if you relate your experiences to me, I will grant that it's most likely that those things exist. I don't need to experience them myself. But at the end of the day, this whole thing is rooted in somebody or something's experiences. And that's all we have. It's this commerce of experience. Uh, the claim that there is something out there that isn't experiential from an ontological perspective, from a metaphysical perspective, is already a gigantic step of abstraction. And then another even bigger step of abstraction is done, which is my experience comes from that thing that I just imagined. It's two gigantic steps. Now, if you take these two steps for granted, then I follow your rationale. If I grant that, okay, there is something outside experience, and that somehow my experience comes from that, then I would say, yes, if we don't understand it today, then of course, one day we will understand it because there is just no other way things could be happening. But no, but then I'm already granting these two gigantic assumptions. And my game is step back. Let's step back. Let's look at the hidden assumptions. Let's look at how this whole thing started. Here is how this whole thing started. Your experiences seem to correlate with mine. So we seem to be inhabiting the same environment that is outside our own personal mentation. If you were in my study right now, you'd be describing the same bookshelf, the same books, the same ceiling. Hey, there seems to be something outside our personal mentations, our personal inner lives. There is something out there, right? Okay, that's the first reason to infer something. And then we say, this something out there is not amenable to my wishes. If it's raining today and I wish really hard it were sunny, it doesn't stop raining. You can wish yourself into becoming blue and the world will not comply. So, hey, there is something out there, number one. And number two, this something out there doesn't care what I think, what I wish. It doesn't care about it at all. Now, number three, this something out there I will label matter. And when I look at myself in the mirror, I see matter. So I seem to be made of that something out there. And my inner brain activity correlates with what I feel from within. Hey, three reasons to say that there is something out there beyond our inner lives that doesn't care about what we think and which correlates with our inner life somehow. These are the three reasons for people to say, this something out there is outside consciousness because I can only conceive of personal consciousness. It's our experience. So my entire conception of mind, of consciousness, is grounded in my personal mind, my personal consciousness. So the moment I say and I acknowledge there is something out there, it must be non-conscious. So that's the first logical fallacy. To say that there is something out there doesn't mean that that something out there has to be ontologically distinct from your conscious inner life. It only means that it has to be out there. There could be experiential states out there that are transpersonal and not personal. So this is how we came up with this assumption of matter fundamentally outside mind, which creates mind. But it's a theoretical inference that has become so natural in our culture that we sort of glance over it without even realizing why we are doing this. Now, I would offer you a different explanation for all this. I would say, look, it is true there is something out there. It is true that we can't control it or change it by just wishing it to be different. And it is true that it looks like what we call matter and that it correlates with my inner life. But the most parsimonious and explanatorily powerful inference to make is that these something out there are experiential states. And I can't control them because I'm dissociated from them. And they look like matter because this is what experiential states look like across a dissociative boundary. And suddenly, I do not have that ontological abyss to link matter to mind. All I have is to explain how experiential states out there modulate the experiential states in here from across a dissociative boundary. Because you see, when I look out, I see rocks, I see the sun. I don't see happiness. I don't see pain. You know what I mean? I don't see endogenous experiential states. I see the qualities of perception. And they follow what's happening out there. There is a consistency across my different perceptual modalities. What I see, what I hear, it's all consistent with one another. So now I have to explain experiential states that are transpersonal out there, modulating experiential states that are personal and within my own dissociative boundary. Well, there's nothing problematic about it. Your thoughts modulate your emotions every single day, even though they are qualitatively completely different. An abstract thought feels very different from an emotion. A perception feels very different from a thought. So your experiential states are very different. You can divide them in categories: imagination, emotion, abstract thought, feeling, all that. And they are all the time modulating one another. I can think myself into despair. I'm sure you can think yourself into despair as well. I can think myself into happiness. Uh, uh, so, hey, that experiential states modulate one another, although they are qualitatively different, is a given. We know it happens. It's happening every day. All I need to infer now is there are experiential states out there that are transpersonal, and from across the dissociative boundary, they are modulating my inner experiential states. And the hard problem disappears. Now you have only one ontological ground, experience. And you have different modalities of experience. And you have this thing called dissociation, whose image, the way it appears to us, is biology. Okay, now sorry for this long
No, totally
discourse.
fine. I really enjoyed the beginning part. The first three things you said, I totally agree with. So we have this, everything comes through us in the form of experience, and there's some thing out there that doesn't conform to my experience. So like, there's some difference between my imagination and my experience. If I imagine a unicorn, I don't see a unicorn. If I want to turn
Exactly.
blue, I don't turn blue. And
Yep.
it seems the case that the thing on the outside has power over my consciousness, and my consciousness doesn't have power over the thing on the outside. Like, for example, we can change our consciousness. If I stick an electrode in my brain, I can see all kinds of colors that I didn't want to. I can like stick it in
Or
the
can
right
take a
place.
pill.
Yeah,
Can get
exactly.
drunk.
Yeah, take some like heroin or something. You get all kinds of.
Exactly.
And so
Of
it
course.
seems like the stuff on the outside can affect my consciousness, but my consciousness can't affect the stuff on the outside.
Oh,
Like you
of course
said, I
you can.
can't. Well, you can. What do you mean?
You can build a house.
Not with my conscience. I can't like think a house. They're like house.
Well, but
No.
it starts as a thought, and then that thought is embodied, of course. But of course, you can change the world, not by wishing it to
Oh
be
yeah,
different.
but
There is an
that's
interface.
for sure. But that's the difference I'm articulating, is that because it seems like the consciousness is weaker or lower hierarchically than the external physical world or whatever that is, which may or may not be just another layer of consciousness, it seems like we shouldn't, the properties of the consciousness things that we have are different from the properties of the things outside of us in the world. And so it seems
Definitely.
strange to say that, well, we should just, those things outside of us are also consciousness because they seem to have different properties. And so to jump from the conclusion that we are conscious and those things have different properties, but they're also some form of consciousness. There's like a bigger consciousness out there that isn't our local kind. Seems very strange when none of the consciousnesses we know of seem to have any control over that external thing. It seems strange to assume that that external thing is just a bigger consciousness, especially because
Okay.
it has those different properties.
These are very good observations. The transpersonal experiential states out there, of course, are overwhelming compared to our little dissociated consciousness. I mean, it's obvious. The inanimate universe, in terms of orders of magnitude, it's slightly bigger than our internal conscious states. Now, the way it exerts power on you, I would say it's very similar to the way you exert power on it. If I shoot a bullet next to your head, nothing will happen to you. One has to shoot a bullet in your head. The same thing, I can wish the world to be different, but nothing will happen to it. But I can build a house. So there is an interface there, and that's the surface of our body. So the world out there can only affect you by affecting your interface, by making you feel cold because of cold air molecules touching your skin, or a surgeon with a scalpel. That scalpel has to go into your head. If I wave the scalpel in front of you, you're immune. Nothing will happen to you. So there seems to be a consistent interface that is bidirectional. And I would say the interface is the image of the dissociative boundary. It is the dissociative boundary. It's what it looks like on the screen of perception. Now, to me, that a surgeon can take an electronic stimulation rod and poke your brain and make you feel all kinds of things, or that a pill that you can swallow like a psychedelic can completely change your inner life. How do I interpret that? For me, the surgeon's scalpel, the surgeon's electrode, the pill, all of this are images of mental processes in the inanimate universe. Uh, your personal mental processes also have images. If I put you on an fMRI right now, I will see all those different little processes going on here and there. So to me, this universe we inhabit is the brain scan. Is a brain scan. It's what the brain scan looks like. These are images of the mental processes in the universe. A scalpel is one of those mental processes. A pill is the image of another one of those mental processes. All matter is the image of mental processes. Now, when a surgeon's electric probe stimulates your brain, what you have there, therefore, is a mental process modulating another mental process, in the same way that photons coming from the outside modulate your experience of vision. It's the same thing. It's just that it's not going according to the channels that evolution made available to us, which is our sense organs. It's sort of hacking its way in, and it's causing a disruption. Of course, mental processes disrupt other mental processes. I mean, if I am feeling very distraught, I can think myself into becoming calm. I can disrupt my distraughtness by interfering with it with another mental process. And these two things would look differently on my brain scan. They would be in different brain areas. Thinking myself into calmness, that process would be here in the prefrontal cortex. The rest would be probably close to my limbic system, deeper in the brain. So yeah, one thing is interfering another. They even have to touch. You would see that happening on a brain scan as well. These processes have to sort of overlap a little bit and establish some kind of feedback mechanism in order for that influence to take effect. So for me, everything we are looking and we are perceiving around us are images of mental processes. And I would be very surprised if a surgeon's scalpel or electrode or a pill wouldn't interfere with my inner life the moment these things enter my body, the moment I allow them to come across my dissociative boundary. And sometimes they come across my dissociative boundary even if I don't allow them. I may wish that a bullet that's coming my way doesn't come into my dissociative boundary, but it will pierce through and it will do something. It may disrupt my dissociative process to the point that it will extinguish the dissociation. In other words, I would die.
Yeah. Well, here's a question for you. So, is there anything that our consciousness can, or is there anything that an external stimulation like an electrode cannot stimulate in our consciousness that our consciousness could stimulate?
I don't know. I'll tell you what my tendency is. My tendency is to think that everything is game. Everything can be stimulated and manipulated if we have fine enough probes to interfere in just the right place with just the right granularity and precision and accuracy. I don't see any reason in principle to think that there is any part of our inner life that is fundamentally immune to being disrupted. But I know people who have all kinds of arguments, including neurosurgeons, who, based on their own experience, they say, well, I can put those probes and cause all kinds of changes, but there are certain things I can never change, such as the sense of I, ipseity, the I-ness, that continuity of the self, whatever. I'm not a neurosurgeon, so I cannot speak from their point of view. If I ignore that, if I pretend that these people are not saying that, I would easily settle for everything can be disrupted, everything can be manipulated. I think this image of my dissociative processes, my body, is a complete image. So there is nothing about my inner life that is not correlated with a part of my body. Even my unconscious, my so-called unconscious, which I would say is the obfuscated mind, correlates probably with other parts of my body that are beyond the nervous system. But I don't think we are immune to being interfered with.
Okay, so a follow-up question would be, which would win out, an electrode stimulation or your conscious thoughts? Like if you were trying to think of something and a doctor was trying to stimulate a different thought in your head, who would win?
Oh, I think if you have enough energy on that probe, ultimately it will win. Sure, because that probe is the image of a conscious process for me. So I'm not saying that matter is winning from consciousness. I'm saying certain processes in consciousness can overwhelm other processes in consciousness. I think an electric stimulant, an electric probe running at 100 volts will overwhelm my deepest and most heartfelt wishes and desires. I don't think I can stop it, no.
All right, and so if you essentially had to, so if you came to like Chinese room example, like Searle, what is his name? Searle, I think.
John Searle,
Yeah,
1980.
yeah. So he used the Chinese room example where you're behind a door and you're essentially get to ask questions to whatever you want, and you get back answers that are intelligible and seem human. Do you have any way to differentiate, like essentially my space alien example, but there's a big wall in between you and the space alien? Is there any way for you to tell if it's a silicone non-conscious rock-based thing or a biological conscious-based thing? How would you be able to tell? Does your model give us any way to be able to tell the difference between those two?
No, if the assumption is there is a wall and I cannot examine what is behind it to see if it's in any way analogous to me. In other words, to see if it bleeds, to see if it sweats, to see if it screams in pain if I poke it, to see if it stays alive if I cut it in half. Without a way to assess that, if it's behind a wall, then all I can access is function. And function, I think, the function of any living being can, in principle, be emulated, and I subtly use another word here, emulated without it implying another dissociative process in universal consciousness, without it implying in private, dissociated inner life. So I would say, no, the only thing I could say is it intelligent enough to pass for a person from my point of view? In other words, there is a way to measure intelligence because intelligence, you can measure it through a black box. You put some inputs and you analyze the outputs. It's a test of function. Intelligence is function. And I think all function can, in principle, be emulated without life, without dissociation. So I wouldn't be able to tell whether what is behind that wall is conscious or not. Having said that, although Searle positions the Chinese room experiment as a criticism of strong artificial intelligence, the intuition he is appealing to is to deny that the Chinese room has conscious insight of what it is doing. In other words, he's appealing to consciousness. He's appealing to what it feels like to understand. And of course, the clerk inside the Chinese room manipulating symbols and writing things down in sheets without knowing what Chinese means, that clerk or the room as a whole does not have the conscious state that we call understanding. Because there is no understanding. But is there intelligence? Of course there is intelligence. Intelligence is function. And X hypothesis, the Chinese room emulates the function, duplicates the function correctly. So I don't think Searle's argument defeats artificial intelligence at all. I think it's a misconstruction. And I think he himself didn't realize this back in 1980. I think it's an argument against the possibility of the Chinese room having conscious insight, not against it being intelligent. He's appealing to conscious insight, not to intelligence.
All right, I totally agree. I don't think it worked against artificial intelligence either. But where would you draw the line, essentially, in life and having consciousness between a brain and essentially, like, would you say that dogs and bats and mice and rats are all conscious, or
I think
like because we made a distinction between the rocks and the people, like where is there a spectrum of consciousness along there?
just so you understand how I approach it from a completely empirical perspective. I know I am conscious, and I know that I attribute consciousness to others on the basis of analogy to me. But I can't be sure because I cannot access your inner life. I do not know whether you are a philosophical zombie. I don't know whether you are just structure and function, not accompanied by inner experience. I cannot know that. All I can do is make an inference based on analogy. So I think different people can reasonably differ on where they place the boundary because it's an inference and that there isn't a way to settle the dispute. So it's about what you consider to be plausible personally. What I consider to be plausible is to go down all the way to the simplest metabolizing organism, which would exclude viruses, because viruses do not have metabolism. But I think I find metabolism so extraordinary, such a such a distinct, idiosyncratic phenomenon in nature, so vastly different from everything else, that I am tempted to say that's the correlate with dissociation, with their being conscious in their life. So I would go down to bacteria, even to archaea. I think archaea metabolize, viruses don't. I think archaea metabolize. No, maybe I'm not sure. I have to update my biology knowledge, but I would go down to full metabolism. But I would exclude viruses because they don't metabolize. So viruses to me would be like complicated nanoscale machines.
So if we had a metabolizing alien come to Earth and it seemed more intelligent than us in some sense, would you grant that it has a higher level of consciousness than we do? Would that be a problem for your worldview?
I think metabolism as we know on Earth evolved on Earth. I think the chances that an alien that evolved in a completely separate way in another planet having the same kind of metabolism we have is not high. Although there could be some fundamental organizing principles in nature that would lead to the same thing elsewhere. I don't know, maybe. If your hypothesis was if it's a metabolizing alien, if I could have access to the physiology of that alien and see that it also has DNA, RNA, also does protein replication, folding, amino acid, all that stuff, then I would be tempted to consider it very plausible that the alien is conscious. But by definition, our notions of plausibility are grounded in the experiences within this ecosystem here, Earth. So when an alien comes, now all bets are off because all of our references are gone. I would be open to both possibilities, the alien being just a machine or the alien being actually a conscious being. Unless the alien looked like a Cylon, then I would go for the machine.
Awesome. Well, this was a really great conversation. We've gone for about an hour and a half now. Thanks for coming on. This was a lot of fun. Is there anything you'd like to say as final notes before we go off?
It was a good conversation.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on. I'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Tom. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.